In 7.3a, we're going to look at another type of factoring. And so remember our definition of factoring. To factor means you factor a polynomial, you define the factors that multiply together to form the product. So we're going to use two types of factoring, and the first one we already talked about. That was GCF factoring. And in that case, our answer looked like a greatest common factor on the outside, and then we put our leftovers back on the inside. Our next type of factoring is called MAM factoring. And the results of MAM factoring are going to be two binomials multiplied together. And remember, a binomial is a equation with two terms in it. So we're going to have a binomial times a binomial. MAM, it stands for multiplication, addition, and multiplication. And we're going to use MAM when we factor trinomials. So we're starting with a trinomial, means it has three terms, and our answer is going to be two binomials being multiplied together. So let's look at our first example here. Factor each trinomial using MAM. So the way it works is I'm going to label my trinomial. The first part's going to be M, the second term is going to be A, and my last term is going to be M. That's where the MAM comes from. Multiply, add, multiply. So now my two M's in my first tic-tac, or my box on the side here, my first box is going to be my M. I'm going to multiply those coefficients together, my two M's. So right here I've got a 1 in front of my x squared, and right here I've got an 8. So 1 times 8 gives me 8. Then my A term, my add term, is going to go in my next box. The A, my add column, is 6. So that's our first step to fill in those two boxes. Then my next step over here is to make a list of possibles. And what I'm looking for is two numbers that multiply to give me 8 and add to give me 6. So I'm going to start by listing all the numbers I can multiply together to give me 8. So if I do 1 times 8, that gives me 8, but if I add 1 plus 8, that gives me 9. So it's not going to be 1 times 8. Then I have 2 times 2 times 4. That multiplies to give me 8, and when I add them, 2 plus 4 gives me 6. So these are my two numbers that I'm going to fill into my other empty boxes. I've got a 2 and I've got a 4. These multiply to give me 8, and they add to give me 6. Then my next step is I'm going to take my numbers and create fractions. So the way it works is I take this number, my first coefficient, 1 and 1, and I'm going to split up my variable. So if I've got x squared, that means 1x goes here, and 1x goes here. Then I'm going to take my two numbers, and those are going to go on the bottom of my fractions. So I've got a 2 and I've got a 4. If you can simplify any of those fractions, that's going to be your next step. But in this case, 1 over 2 and 1 over 4, that's as simple as it gets, so we can't simplify. Finally, once I have my fractions, I can create my binomial. So this fraction right here becomes 1x, which is just x, plus 2. And this fraction becomes x plus 4. And this is my final answer for that trinomial. So it seems complicated at first, but really you just take it step by step and it'll get a lot easier the second time around. So let's do it again here. Number 2, I'm going to label my trinomial MAM. I'm going to take my two numbers, my two m's, multiply them together, and I get 24. That's my m. And then my a is 14. So in my list of possibles, I need to find two numbers that multiply to give me 24 and add to give me 14. So if I've got 1 times 24, 1 plus 24 is 25, so that's not my answer. Got 2 and 12. 2 plus 12 is 14, and that's what I was looking for. So that means these are my numbers that are going to go in these empty boxes. So I've got 2 and I've got 12. Next step, I'm going to take my numbers and create my fractions. So my rule again, I take my coefficient out front, goes on both fractions, and then my variable is split between. So since I've got two x's, I got one x on each. Then I put my other numbers on the bottom, my 2 and my 12. And I simplify, which I can't simplify 1 over 2 or 1 over 12, so those are my final answers. Next, I write my binomials. So I've got 1x plus 2, and I've got 1x plus 12. And there's my answer right there. So if you want to check your answer, we can use our FOIL method to check and see if we got the right answer. So if we multiplied our first two terms, that would give me x squared. X times 12 gives me 12x. 2 times x is 2x. And 2 times 12 is 24. I can combine my like terms in the middle, and I get x squared plus 14x plus 24, which is what I started with, right? So that means that this right here, my answer, is equal to what I started with. Alright, we got 4 more examples here, and the more we practice this, the faster it's going to get. So I'm going to label my trinomial MAM. My first box, I'm going to multiply my numbers together. 1 times 12 gives me 12, and then my add is a negative 7. Okay, and now I'm going to make my list of possibles. So the first things I can multiply to give me 12 would be 1 times 12. But here I see that I have a negative 7. If I'm going to add numbers to give me a negative number, that means that at least one has to be negative. But if I want to multiply to give me a positive number, that means they both need to be negative. So when I'm checking my possibles here, I'm going to make them all negatives. So I have negative 1 plus negative 12, which gives me negative 13. So not quite what I'm looking for. I'll try the next one. Negative 2 times negative 6. That would give me a positive 12. And negative 2 plus negative 6, that gives me negative 8. Okay, let's try another one. Negative 3 times negative 4. Negative 3 plus negative 4 gives me negative 7. So that is what I'm looking for. Multiply to give me positive 12, add to give me negative 7. So I've got negative 3 and negative 4. Now I can create my fraction. So I take that constant and I'm going to put it on the top of both fractions. I'm going to split my variable. So since I've got m squared, I've got 1m for each fraction. Then I take my two numbers and put them on the bottom. Can't simplify those fractions at all. So I'm going to write my final binomial, which would be m minus 3 this time. Since I have a negative 3, it's a minus 3. And I've got m minus 4. And there is your answer. Okay, let's do number 4. I'll label MAM. Okay, when I multiply my two constants together, I have 1 times negative 14, which is negative 14. And then my add, I have a negative 5. So let's make my list of possibles. Now I'm trying to multiply to give me a negative and add to give me a negative. So that means that one of my numbers is going to be negative. The other has to be positive if I'm going to multiply to get a negative number. And since my add column is negative, that means my bigger number is going to be negative. So if I multiply 1 times 14, one of those has to be negative, and it's going to be the bigger one, since when I add them together, it's got to still stay negative. So 1 times negative 14 would give me negative 14 and multiplied, but 1 plus negative 14 gives me negative 13. So try the next one. 2 times a negative 7. 2 plus a negative 7 gives me negative 5. So this is my answer right here. I've got a 2 and I've got a negative 7. Next, I'm going to write my fractions. So I've got my constant on both fractions. And this time I've got n squared, so each fraction gets an n. Then I'm going to take my two numbers and put them on the bottom of my fractions. Can't simplify those fractions, so I can write my final answer as n plus 2, since I have a positive 2, and I've got n minus 7, since I've got that negative 7 on the bottom. And that's my answer. Okay, number 5, MAM. When I multiply my two numbers together, I've got 1 times a negative 12, which is negative 12, and then my add number, there's a 1 in front of my r, a positive 1. So now I'm going to make my list of possibles. I want to multiply to give me a negative, so that tells me one number has to be negative, but I'm going to get a positive number when I add them together. So that means my bigger number has to be positive. So if I multiply 1 times 12, my bigger number has to stay positive, so that means my 1 is going to be negative. Negative 1 times 12, or plus 12, gives me 11. So let's try the next one. My bigger number needs to stay positive, so I have negative 2 times 6. Negative 2 plus 6 gives me 4. Then I've got negative 3 times 4, and negative 3 plus 4 gives me 1. So that's the combination I'm looking for. I've got a negative 3 and 4. Next, I'm going to make my fraction, so I'm going to take that 1, the constant goes on both fractions, and I split my variable. Got 1r, and then I take my two numbers and put them on the bottom. Again, can't simplify either of those fractions, so I can just go ahead and write my final answer, which would be r minus 3 and r plus 4. Okay, we've got one more example here. I'm gonna label my MAM. I've got 1 times 1 for my multiply, and I've just got 1 for my add. So here, if I make a list of possibles, both of them are positive, so that means both of my numbers are going to be positive, and the only thing I can multiply to give me 1 would be 1 times 1. But when I add 1 times 1, that gives me 2. So there's no way that I could multiply two numbers to give me 1 and add them to give me 1. So this means that my trinomial is prime. We cannot factor this one.